Since your husband is gone, you should stop clinging to this old farmhouse. Pack up, move out, and let us take care of things." My daughter-in-law's words cut through the silence of the dinner table like a cold blade. My son didn't argue, he just kept his eyes on his plate and muttered, "It's what Dad would have wanted?" The mashed potatoes on my fork turned to paste in my mouth. For a moment, I felt invisible in my own kitchen. The same kitchen where I once baked his birthday cakes and bandaged his scraped knees. That night, I didn't argue. I only pressed my lips together, stood up, and let the silence do all the talking. I know you've probably seen or heard stories like this before, but this one is mine. And if you stay with me until the end, I promise you'll understand why I chose not to fight back that night and how it turned out to be the smartest decision I ever made. Comment below the city you're watching from. I'd love to see just how far this story travels. The dining room was heavy with a kind of absence that only grief can carve. Cal's chair sat empty at the head of the table, its cushion still bearing the faint indentation of a man who never came home from his morning walk last week. 32 years of marriage, and all it took was one sudden heart attack to leave me stranded in this drafty farmhouse on the edge of Cedar Falls. I tried to steady myself by tracing the worn grooves of the oak table, remembering how Cal used to drum his fingers here whenever he was trying to fix something in his mind. But tonight, all I felt was the weight of being outnumbered. Britt had her phone out pretending to check the time, though I caught the glint of a camera lens pointing toward the kitchen. She was snapping photos as if my home were already hers to list online. Ethan didn't stop her. He only shifted uncomfortably, tapping his wedding band against his glass of water, a nervous tick that once meant he was about to confess stealing a cookie from the jar. Now it meant something else, betrayal cloaked in quiet compliance. I didn't cry in front of them. Instead, I reached for Cal's old brass key hanging on a chain around my neck, twisting it between my fingers like a rosary. He'd given it to me on our 25th anniversary with a wink. "This is the only key you'll ever need. Everything I build with you in mind." Back then, I thought he was being romantic. Now I wondered if he'd been warning me. Just as the clock struck 8, a sound jolted us all, the heavy thunk of mail sliding through the front slot. Britt barely looked up, but I felt my stomach tighten. The envelope sat on the floor, stamped in Red County Recording Office. Urgent. My hands trembled as I picked it up, though I didn't dare open it with them watching. Britt's eyes flickered to the envelope, and for the first time that evening, her smile faltered. I excused myself, slipped it beneath the stack of sympathy cards on the counter, and returned to the table, forcing my voice to stay even. But inside, I knew something had shifted. Cal had left me one last message, and whatever was inside that envelope might be the difference between losing everything and finally standing on my own. The following Sunday, I agreed to meet Ethan and Britt at Maple Street Diner, the kind of small-town place where everybody knows you by name, and the walls are plastered with yellowed photographs of high school football teams. Normally, it was where Cal and I would come after church for pancakes drowned in syrup, a place of comfort. But that day, I walked in with a pit in my stomach. Grief already made me raw, and the way Britt's text had read, "lunch." "Need to talk" didn't sound like an invitation so much as a summons. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and I could feel heads turn. People still whispered condolences whenever they saw me. The widow in the old farmhouse. Some meant well, others just liked having a new topic for coffee gossip. I slid into the booth across from Ethan and Britt. She was already stirring her iced tea with that smug precision of hers, the lemon slice bobbing like it had been rehearsed. Ethan kept his eyes on the menu, though I doubt he was reading. "I ordered for you," Britt said sweetly, though her voice carried more to the booths nearby than to me. "Meatloaf special, right, comfort food. You'll need it after what we're going to tell you." My fork froze halfway to my mouth when the waitress set down the plate. Britt didn't wait for me to respond. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, like she owned the conversation. We've booked movers. They can come the first week of next month. And the realtor already has a photographer lined up. The house will look wonderful online, lots of potential buyers in Cedar Falls these days. I blinked at her. Photographer, realtor, Britt, this is my home. Correction, she said crisply, adjusting her napkin like a lawyer before a jury. It was your husband's. And now, it should pass to Ethan, so it can keep serving family. It's too much house for you alone, don't you agree? Her words carried, and I knew half the diner was listening. I turned to Ethan, desperate for a flicker of my little boy who once clung to me after nightmares. He didn't meet my eyes. Mom, he mumbled. Dad would have wanted what's practical. You know, keeping up that place is going to break you. Let us help. But it wasn't help. It was dispossession dressed in Sunday manners. My cheeks burned as I realized we weren't having a family discussion, we were staging a public announcement. The neighbors, 2 booths down, had stopped eating. Even the waitress slowed at the coffee pot, pretending to check refills while eavesdropping. I set my fork down carefully so my trembling hands wouldn't betray me. You've already made arrangements. My voice cracked despite my effort. Britt smiled, all teeth. Of course. You'll be safer somewhere manageable. There's a lovely senior apartment complex with shuttle service. We've toured it. Bright, clean, no stairs. You'll thank us later. She reached across the table and patted my wrist like she was placing a lid on a trash bin. A roar built inside my chest. I wanted to shout, to demand how they could erase me so casually 1 week after burying the man I'd built a life with. But something inside whispered, not here. Not now. I swallowed the words like bitter medicine. Let them think they'd won this round. I paid for my own meal and left before dessert menus landed. Outside, the Iowa wind cut across the parking lot, snapping at my black cardigan. Ethan followed me to the car, hands stuffed in his pockets. Mom, please don't make this harder. We're trying to do the right thing. I stared at him, this grown man who once believed I could fix anything with a hug, and wondered when he stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an obstacle. My throat closed. I couldn't answer, so I simply got in the car and drove away. When I pulled into the farmhouse driveway, something was different. The front door lock, Cal's old sturdy brass, caught and scraped like it had been tampered with. I jiggled the key, finally forcing it open, and my stomach sank. On the kitchen counter sat a pamphlet for a locksmith service carelessly left behind. My son's handwriting scrawled across it, "Will call back." I stood there in the fading afternoon light, staring at that note. It was like they'd already declared me unfit, already changed the locks on my life. I wanted to collapse. Instead, I went to the pile of sympathy cards on the counter and pulled out the envelope from the county recording office I'd hidden there days earlier. The paper inside smelled faintly of toner and bureaucracy, but the bold header made my knees weaken. Enhanced life estate deed, Holder Lorraine Whitaker. My name. Not Ethan's, not Britt's, mine. The farmhouse remained mine until my last breath. And when that day came, the property wasn't earmarked for Ethan at all. It was directed into the Cedar Falls Community Land Trust for affordable housing and local stewardship. Cal had done this deliberately, quietly 5 years ago. I traced his signature with my finger, tears stinging my eyes. My husband, the man they said would have wanted me gone, had spent his last years making sure I could never be pushed aside. He knew. He must have seen this coming, the greed, the subtle cruelty. That key around my neck wasn't just sentimental. It was proof of trust. Proof that he believed I would carry on even if our own blood turned cold. Outside, a hawk wheeled above the fields, its shadow sweeping across the yard. I pressed the deed to my chest, breathing in the dusty scent of paper and old wood. For the first time in days, my hands stopped shaking. They thought I had nothing left. They thought grief had emptied me out. But tucked in this envelope was something far heavier than sorrow, the beginnings of a fight I hadn't known I was preparing for. I folded the deed carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it beneath Cal's photograph on the mantel. He smiled out from that picture taken at a county fair, eyes crinkling in the late summer sun. "You knew, didn't you?" I whispered. "You left me the tools. Now I just have to learn how to use them." For the first time since the funeral, I slept through the night not peacefully, but with a strange electric kind of anticipation. Tomorrow, I would begin. The morning after that restless but determined sleep, I brewed a pot of coffee in Cal's dented old percolator. The smell was sharp, bitter grounding. I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope spread before me like a secret weapon. Every time I reread the words, "Enhanced Life Estate Deed," I felt Cal's presence, quiet, methodical, protective. He hadn't left me unarmed. I realized I couldn't keep this discovery to myself. Paper was only paper until you understood its power. So I made 2 phone calls. The first was to First Farmers Bank, where Cal had kept accounts since his first construction job. The second was to a name Cal had scrawled on a sticky note in his desk drawer, Caleb Rhodes, attorney at law. Caleb had once handled a zoning appeal for Cal's crew. He was steady, practical, and not easily rattled, the kind of man Cal respected. By 10 o'clock, I was walking into the bank. Sunlight streamed through tall glass windows, glinting off brochures about farm loans and retirement planning. Behind the desk sat Priya Patel, the branch manager. She was in her 40s, known for remembering not just names, but birthdays, and she'd always asked about Cal whenever I deposited checks. When she saw me, her expression softened. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm so sorry about Cal," she said. "He always talked about you when he came in, said you were the reason he worked so hard." Her words hit me like a gentle hand on my shoulder. I nodded, then pulled the envelope from my purse. "Priya, I found this deed after the funeral. I don't know exactly what it means, but I have a feeling it matters. Can you help me understand?" She adjusted her glasses and scanned the pages. After a moment, her brows lifted. "This is an enhanced life estate deed. Very smart move. It means you hold absolute control over your property. Until your death, you can sell, lease, mortgage, do whatever you like. After you pass, ownership goes exactly where your husband designated. In this case, the community land trust. Your son has no legal standing to force you out." My breath caught. So when they said the house would go to Ethan, Priya shook her head firmly. "Not unless you voluntarily deed it to him. This document is ironclad." For the first time, the crushing weight of helplessness eased. I wasn't trapped. I had leverage. Priya lowered her voice. "Mrs. Whitaker, there's something else. Cal opened a few accounts you might not know about: transfer on death and payable on death accounts. They're structured to flow directly to you, bypassing probate. Would you like me to print the balances?" My fingers tightened around the strap of my purse. "Please," she returned with a folder. The numbers inside made my knees weak, not millions, but enough to live comfortably for years. Cal had been quietly funneling money into safety nets with my name on them. Tears blurred my vision as I whispered, "He was protecting me even from our own son." Priya reached across the desk. "Don't let anyone rush you into decisions. You have more security than you realize. And if anyone pressures you, call me. I'll vouch for these accounts." That afternoon, I carried my documents to Caleb Rhodes' law office, a modest brick building tucked between a barber shop and an insurance agency. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old leather. Caleb rose from behind his desk, tall and broad-shouldered, with gray at his temples. He shook my hand firmly, the kind of grip that conveyed both strength and respect. "I knew Cal for years," he said. "He was cautious, maybe even stubborn, but always 2 steps ahead. What's on your mind?" I laid out the deed, the account statements, and Britt's threats. Caleb read silently, his eyes narrowing slightly. Finally, he leaned back. You've got more power than you think, Mrs. Whitaker. That deed means they can't touch your house. And these accounts? They're yours outright. But there's another piece. He pulled a file from his cabinet. Cal asked me to draft promissory notes a few years ago. Loans made to Ethan for his so-called investment projects. They were never gifts legally speaking. There's over $70,000 outstanding plus interest. You're the successor creditor now. The room tilted slightly. My son owed me money. All those times he'd come around asking Cal for help, it hadn't been generosity, it had been debt. Caleb's voice was steady. You don't have to enforce it immediately, but it's leverage. If Ethan tries to contest your control or harasses you further, you have documented claims. I left his office with a strange cocktail of emotions, grief, anger, but also the first sparks of resolve. That evening, I drove to the edge of town, where the old grain lot stood overgrown with weeds. Cal had mentioned it often, but brushed aside my questions. I unlocked the rusted gate with the brass key I still wore around my neck. Inside, I found fresh tire tracks and a laminated notice staked in the ground. Proposed site for Cedar Falls Hospital expansion. Pending city council vote. The pieces began to align. Cal had tied the farmhouse to me, but the grain lot leased to the hospital foundation was the real chessboard. If the hospital wanted that land, I held the cards. And from the way Britt had smirked about potential buyers, I suspected she already had her eyes on a payout she thought she controlled. Back home, I spread the documents across Cal's old drafting table, the deed, the bank statements, the promissory notes, the hospital notice. It looked less like clutter and more like a battle map. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat down, and whispered into the quiet house. All right, Cal, you built the fortress. Now it's my turn to defend it. For the first time, I didn't feel like prey. I felt like a woman sharpening her tools. It didn't take long for Ethan and Britt to sense that something had shifted. I hadn't yelled, I hadn't begged, but I also hadn't folded. That unsettled them more than any outburst would have. They started pressing harder, as though ramping up pressure might finally crack me. It began with a knock on the door one Wednesday evening. When I opened it, the flashing red and blue of a police cruiser lit up my porch. 2 officers stood there, polite but firm. Mrs. Whitaker. We received a call from a family member concerned about your welfare. Something about forgetfulness, unsafe living conditions. Behind them, I caught sight of Britt's SUV idling at the corner, her silhouette glowing from the phone screen in her lap. My stomach turned cold. She'd actually filed a wellness check painting me as senile to authorities. I straightened my back. Officers, I may be grieving, but I assure you I am perfectly capable. Would you like to step inside? They did a quick look around, probably expecting to find overflowing trash or a stove left burning. Instead, they saw neatly stacked laundry, a pot of soup simmering, and bills organized in a folder on the counter. When they left, one officer gave me an apologetic half-smile. Sorry for the trouble, ma'am. You're fine. As their taillights disappeared, Britt's SUV pulled away. I stood in the quiet driveway, hands clenched at my sides. She hadn't just insulted me. She'd tried to put an official stamp on my incompetence. The next morning, the front door resisted again. The lock clicked in an unfamiliar way. On the mat lay a folded receipt from Cedar Key Locksmiths. I knew then that Ethan had gone behind my back. My key still worked, but only because they hadn't finished the job. The message was clear. You don't belong here anymore. I refused to be cornered. I pulled out my phone and began photographing everything: the receipt, the police visit report number, even the faint tire tracks in the driveway. Caleb had told me document everything. Sunlight is your ally. But Britt wasn't finished. That same afternoon, a neighbor stopped by with a concerned frown. I saw something online. Is it true you're moving to assisted living? My stomach dropped. I borrowed her phone and saw Britt's latest Facebook post, a glossy photo of Ethan smiling beside their daughter, captioned, "Doing what's best for mom-in-law." Sometimes the hardest decisions are the kindest. Hundreds of sympathetic comments flooded below, praising their sacrifice in taking on my burdens. Burden. That word clung to me like ash. They were rewriting the story before my eyes, painting themselves saints, and me a confused relic. That evening, Caleb called. "I've drafted a cease and desist letter for harassment and interference with your property. I'll send copies to both of them and to the sheriff's office. And Lori, don't delete those posts. Save screenshots. They tell a story too." I thanked him, my voice steadier than I felt. The following week, I forced myself into a new rhythm. Morning coffee, then scanning every corner of the house with my phone camera. Afternoon calls with Priya or Caleb, checking what rights and options I had. Evening long walks down the gravel road, letting the cold Iowa air sting my lungs, reminding me I was still alive, still moving. One night on my walk, I passed the old grain lot again. A yellow construction sign had been posted, "Public Hearing. Proposed Hospital Expansion Council Chambers, March 5th. I touched the brass key at my neck. Cal had left me this leverage. If the hospital wanted that land, they would have to deal with me, not Ethan. But Ethan wasn't waiting. 2 days later, I received an email not from him, but from a hospital representative. "Polite formal. Following up on your son's outreach regarding the property. We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss terms." My son was pretending to hold the reins. He had approached the hospital behind my back, claiming authority he didn't have. Fury surged hot and unsteady, but underneath it was something sharper clarity. I forwarded the email straight to Caleb with a note, "They think he speaks for me. Time to correct that." That night, I sat at Cal's drafting table again, laying out all the papers, like puzzle pieces, deed accounts, promissory notes, screenshots of Britt's posts, the hospital notice. The farmhouse smelled faintly of sawdust, still from all those years he'd worked late, smoothing out edges, never leaving things rough. I whispered into the silence, "I won't let them bulldoze what we built." The grief was still there, curling in the corners of every room. But layered on top was something else now, a flint-like determination. If Ethan and Britt wanted a battle, they'd get one. Only this time, I wouldn't fight on their terms. I'd fight on mine. The first Tuesday of March, the Cedar Falls City Council chambers were standing room only. Farmers in worn denim jackets, nurses still in scrubs, and young parents juggling restless toddlers filled the rows of folding chairs. Everyone wanted to hear about the hospital's proposed expansion, how much land it would swallow, whose property lines it would test, whose taxes might rise. I sat in the back, at first my deed folded carefully in a manila envelope pressed against my chest like a shield. The wood-paneled walls smelled faintly of floor polish and coffee, the hum of murmurs almost drowning out the gavel as the council chair called the meeting to order. And then I saw them, Britt hair, sleek and blazer sharp, seated near the front beside a hospital representative. Ethan at her side, trying to look confident, but drumming his fingers against his knee. My stomach clenched. They had positioned themselves as if they already belonged at that table, as if the farmhouse and the grain lot were theirs to negotiate. The council reviewed preliminary slides, projected hospital growth, parking needs, economic benefits. Then came the map. Bright red lines slashed across the screen, and there it was, the old grain lot labeled Future Parking Deck. The chair cleared his throat. Public comments are now open. Britt was first to leap up her heels, clicking like punctuation. She introduced herself with sugary polish, praising the hospital's role in the community. "Our family is eager to support this project," she declared, "and we're already in discussions to facilitate a smooth transfer of property." Her eyes scanned the room, landing on me with a triumphant glint. Ethan nodded stiffly beside her. A ripple of agreement moved through the audience. The hospital was beloved here. People wanted expansion, more jobs, more beds. My chest felt tight. For a moment, I almost stayed seated. It would have been easier to slip out quietly, let them spin their story. But then, my hand brushed the brass key at my neck, warm from my skin. Cal's key. His promise. My legs steadied beneath me. I stood. "Madam Chair," I said, voice firmer than I expected. "My name is Lorraine Whitaker, and I need to clarify a few things about that parcel of land." All eyes turned. I walked to the podium, the envelope tucked beneath my arm. Britt's smile faltered. Ethan's fingers froze mid-tap. I took a breath and pulled out the first document. This is a recorded, enhanced life estate deed. It names me as sole controller of my property, the farmhouse, the grain lot, until my death. No sale, no transfer, no negotiation can happen without my signature. My son, I glanced toward Ethan, is not authorized to speak on my behalf. Gasps rippled through the room. A council member leaned forward, squinting at the deed projected on the overhead, as Caleb, seated behind me, held up the certified copy for the clerk. Britt sprang to her feet. "That can't be right. Ethan is the heir." "Not while I'm alive," I said evenly, "and certainly not in violation of recorded law." I let the murmurs die down before laying out the second sheet, the ground lease addendum Cal had filed. 5 years ago, my late husband signed a lease with the hospital foundation. Clause 12 states that if the property is reclaimed for expansion, the owner is entitled to a relocation premium. That premium is not optional. It is enforceable. The hospital's attorney leaned into his microphone. "We were not aware of that provision." "You should have been," Caleb interjected smoothly. "It's part of the public record." The council chamber buzzed. Britt's face drained of color. Ethan shifted shoulders, caving inward. I wasn't finished. I pulled out one more sheet, my hand steady now. "And in case there's doubt about interest, I hold here a right of first refusal letter from the Cedar Valley Medical Group. They've already expressed willingness to pay above-market rent for parking elsewhere if this land becomes unavailable. So whichever way this council votes, I am not without options." The silence that followed was almost sweet. I could feel the weight of the room, tilting public opinion, sliding away from Britt's polished narrative and toward the widow who had just outmaneuvered them all. The hospital attorney whispered urgently to his colleague, then addressed the council. Given these revelations, the foundation would like to request a recess. The gavel struck. 15 tense minutes passed in the hallway where neighbors came up to squeeze my hand, whispering, "Good for you, Lori." About time, someone stood up. When the session resumed, the hospital presented a new offer on the record. A brand new market pavilion built at city expense to relocate the craft stalls Cal had envisioned. A lifetime stipend for me to manage it, ensuring stable income. A $420,000 lump sum relocation payment. And in recognition of Cal's contributions, the creation of the Cal Whitaker Scholarship Fund for vocational trades at Cedar Falls Community College. I took the pen they offered and signed, hands no longer trembling. My husband's foresight had carried me to this moment, but it was my choice to wield it. Behind me, I heard a choked noise. Ethan had gone pale. Britt hissed in his ear, but the council clerk was already stamping the documents. The deal was sealed. As I turned to leave the podium, Caleb pressed a final folder into my hand. "Time to close another loop," he murmured. Back at my seat, I slid it across to Ethan. His eyes widened as he read promissory notes. Outstanding debt $72,000 plus interest. Payable to estate successor, Lorraine Whitaker. Britt snatched at the paper, scanning. "These say loans. Wade, you told me those were gifts." Ethan's face crumpled. "Dad never asked me to pay." "He did," I said softly, my voice cutting through the din. "And he kept records. You owe me, Ethan. Not just respect, but repayment." Britt shot to her feet, her voice shrill. "We'll contest this. You can't hold this over us." Caleb's reply was calm, almost bored. "There's an in terrorem clause in Mr. Whitaker's trust. If you contest, Ethan forfeits any remaining inheritance. Your choice." The chamber was dead silent. For the first time in months, I felt taller, stronger. Not because I had humiliated them, but because I had survived them. I walked out of that council chamber with the whole town watching not as a frail widow to be pitied, but as a woman who had taken back her voice. News of the council meeting spread through Cedar Falls faster than any official minutes ever could. By the next morning, neighbors who had once offered me sympathetic casseroles were now stopping me in the grocery store aisles to say, "You showed real grit, Lori. Proud of you." For the first time since Cal's funeral, I didn't feel like the town widow to be pitied. I felt seen. But the fallout landed hard on Ethan and Britt. 2 weeks after the meeting, a moving truck idled in front of their split-level house. I watched from across the street as Britt directed the movers with sharp gestures, her jaw tight. Their carefully staged furniture, the same pieces she'd tried to plant in my farmhouse, was being loaded out, not in. The whispers were everywhere: Ethan's failed investment projects, the loans Cal had documented, the debt now legally in my hands. Caleb had drawn up a payment plan, monthly installments stretching across 8 years. The first payment came from the sale of Britt's prized SUV, a gleaming white Lexus that had once carried her to brunches and charity luncheons. I heard she wept when she signed the transfer papers. Ethan came to see me one evening, shoulders slumped, a man stripped of all his borrowed confidence. He stood awkwardly on the porch, clutching a plain envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, an apology. He admitted he'd let Britt's ambitions become his own, that he'd confused inheritance with entitlement. "I'll pay what I owe," he wrote. "I just hope someday you can look at me and see your son again." I didn't invite him in, but I didn't slam the door either. Consistency before closeness, I told him quietly. Show me through action, not words. Meanwhile, I threw myself into reshaping the farmhouse. The hospital's relocation payment had cleared more money than I'd ever handled at once. Instead of letting it sit, I poured it into repairs, a new roof, a security system, and most importantly, converting the back rooms into artist residencies. Cal had always loved the idea of giving young craftspeople a place to work. Now, each month, rent from those residents flowed steadily into my account, turning grief into growth. The first evening, they moved in the farmhouse, filled with sounds I hadn't heard in years. Guitar strings tuning in one room, paintbrushes clinking in jars in another. For once, the house didn't echo with emptiness. It pulsed with new beginnings. On weekends, I visited the site of the soon-to-be pavilion. The hospital had already broken ground, and the city had hung a banner across the fence, future home of the Whitaker Market Pavilion. Seeing Cal's name honored in public, etched into the community's future, filled me with a pride that blunted even the sharpest edges of my sorrow. Britt, of course, didn't show her face around town much anymore. When she did, it was with the brittle smile of someone who had lost the script. Without the farmhouse, without the SUV, without the narrative of sacrificing for an aging mother-in-law, she had no audience left to applaud her. And Ethan? He worked 2 jobs now. One at the feed store, another as a delivery driver at night. Each month, a small check arrived in my mailbox. Not much, not yet, but it was signed, dated, and real. Proof that perhaps accountability had finally replaced entitlement. I often thought of Cal during those days. He had built structures, bridges, grain silos, things meant to last. But his greatest architecture had been this, the quiet scaffolding he left behind, so I could rebuild a life not dependent on pity or permission. Standing on the farmhouse porch at sunset, the fields stretching out gold and endless, I realized I had been given more than protection. I had been given a second chance. 6 months after the council meeting, spring returned to Cedar Falls. The frost lifted from the fields, and daffodils pushed their yellow heads through the soil along the farmhouse driveway. I found myself rising earlier these days, not out of anxiety, but anticipation. Life had become full again, but in a quieter, more intentional way. Every Saturday morning, I walked down to the new Whitaker Market Pavilion. It wasn't finished yet, but the frame already stood tall beams smelling of fresh-cut pine. A banner stretched across the entrance, future home of local makers and the Cal Whitaker Scholarship Fund. Watching vendors stake out their future stalls, I felt something inside me heal. This wasn't just about land or money anymore. It was about legacy, about turning pain into something that would outlive both me and the ones who had tried to erase me. The farmhouse had changed too. Where once the rooms echoed with silence, now laughter and music floated through the halls. The young artists I'd taken in painted late into the night, or strummed guitars on the porch swing. Sometimes I joined them sitting quietly with my tea content just to listen. I'd never expected to live with roommates in my late 60s, but it felt less like sharing space and more like sharing purpose. Ethan still mailed his checks. Small, steady like clockwork. Each one accompanied by a note, still trying Mom. The first few I left unopened, but now I read them. His handwriting, shaky at first, had grown firmer. I wasn't ready to forgive, not fully, but I no longer burned with anger. Boundaries, I had learned, are not walls, they are doors that stay locked until trust earns a key. Maybe someday he would earn his. As for Britt, she drifted further into the background of my life, her sharp edges dulled by silence. I heard she had taken an office job in Des Moines, commuting back and forth. Perhaps she too was learning that you can't build a future on someone else's ruin. In the evenings, I still sat at Cal's old drafting table. Only now the papers spread before me weren't deeds or promissory notes, but sketches from the residents, new designs for the pavilion booths, murals for the community center. Sometimes I traced Cal's old blueprints with my fingers, marveling at how his careful lines had somehow guided me here. One night, I found myself speaking out loud as if he were still across from me. "You didn't just protect me, Cal. You gave me freedom. You gave me the chance to decide who I am when no one else gets to decide for me." The brass key still hung at my neck, but it no longer felt like an anchor to the past. It felt like a compass pointing forward. I think about those first days after his funeral, when I believed I had lost everything. And I realize now, sometimes life strips you bare so you can discover what you were carrying all along. Strength, dignity, a voice that refuses to be silenced. If you are listening to this perhaps from your own kitchen table or lying awake at night, I want you to know this. You are not a burden. You are not disposable. You deserve respect even when the people closest to you forget what that word means. And sometimes, standing your ground is the most loving thing you can do for yourself, and even for those who once tried to push you aside. So, I ask you if you've stayed with me to the end to share your story. Comment below where you're watching from, and maybe even tell me one boundary you're proud of holding. Because boundaries aren't barriers, they're bridges to a life lived with peace. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the fields, I poured myself a glass of red wine and stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled of cut grass and rain. Somewhere in the distance, the first crickets of spring sang their chorus. I raised my glass toward the horizon. "To you, Cal," I whispered, "for building walls that became my wings." And as dusk settled soft and forgiving across Cedar Falls, I finally understood freedom isn't loud. It doesn't always come with applause or vindication. Sometimes freedom is simply this, sitting on your own porch, in your own home, with no one left to tell you where you don't belong. At its heart, this story is not just about property deeds, debts, or family conflict. It is about dignity. Too often, when people grow older, others assume they've outlived their usefulness or that their voice no longer matters. Lori's journey reminds us that self-respect isn't something you hand over to convenience or to the loudest voice in the room. It's built through choices, boundaries, and the quiet strength to say, "I belong here. My life still carries weight." For many older Americans, this truth resonates deeply. Maybe you felt pressured to downsize before you were ready, or dismissed when you offered wisdom hard-earned over decades. What Lori's story shows is that love and loyalty mean little without respect, and that protecting your future financially and emotionally is not selfish, but necessary. The lesson is clear: know your rights, value your worth, and don't let anyone convince you that being cautious or firm makes you unkind. In fact, it may be the greatest act of love for yourself and for those who will learn by watching you. If this story spoke to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments where you're watching from, or one boundary you've held onto that made you stronger. Your words might encourage someone else who needs that reminder tonight. Until then, may you find peace in your own home, strength in your own story, and comfort in knowing you are never alone. Wishing you a gentle evening and a warm tomorrow.